Olá, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Meu nome é Isabela Albuquerque e eu sou professora de História Medieval na Universidade de Pernambuco, campus Garanhuns. Estou aqui hoje com a professora Rayane Grangeiro, que é mestre em História pela UF, com sua dissertação As Mulheres em Beowulf, a representação feminina na sociedade anglo-saxã dos séculos VII e VIII. E Rayane e eu fazemos parte do grupo Ínsula, que é um grupo de estudos interdisciplinar sobre a Britânia, Irlanda e as ilhas do Arquipélago Norte, na Antiguidade e no Medievo. Eu coordeno o grupo juntamente com a professora Elaine Farrell e o professor Renato Pinto. E hoje, especificamente, na nossa live, é em comemoração ao Dia Internacional da Mulher. E, consequentemente, vamos falar sobre mulheres, sobre estudos de gênero, e contamos com uma especialista conosco hoje, que é a professora doutora Felice Lifshitz, da Universidade de Alberta, no Canadá. Tá? Agora nós vamos passar, mudar a chave aqui para nos comunicarmos em língua inglesa, para que a nossa palestrante possa compreender, e daremos sequência à nossa série intitulada Ínsula Entrevista, na qual nós sempre trazemos um pesquisador ou uma pesquisadora que tem temáticas relacionadas à ilha ou especificamente às ilhas, para falar um pouco sobre a área, sobre suas pesquisas e sobre os estudos mais recentes, tá? Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you all are. As I said before, my name is Isabela Albuquerque, and I'm a lecturer in medieval history at University of Pernambuco and one of the coordinators of Group Insulae, which is based in Federal University of Pernambuco. And I'm one of the coordinators along Dr. Elaine Farrell and Dr. Renato Pinto. And I'm accompanied today by Rayane Grangeiro, one of her members, to carry out this interview, as I may say, a very special in celebration of International Women's Day. And these live interviews are part of our project called Insulae Interviews, in which researchers from Brazil and abroad are invited to talk about a specific topic or something related to the islands. Here today, we have the presence of Professor Dr. Felice Lifshitz, specialist in gender studies. And just before we start, I would like to do a brief and very summarized reading of her extensive CV. She did her undergraduate in medieval studies at Columbia, and also her master and PhD in history from the same institution. She has held the chair of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Alberta since 2011. She's the author of Writing Normandy, Stories of Saints and Rulers, published in 2020, and also Religious Women in Early Carolingia Francia, a study of manuscript transmission and monastic culture. Alongside with other papers, book chapters, book editions, plus a large experience in research, not only in Canada, in the US, but also in Germany and France. So lots of things. Felice, first of all, I would like to thank you for agreeing to participate with us in this live, and talking and bringing some of your knowledge and your experience in the area.
Okay, well, and thank you for asking me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Ok, bom, Boa tarde para todos e todas. Vamos começar então as nossas perguntas, né, para a nossa convidada, a professora Felice. E quem tiver interesse de enviar uma pergunta para a gente, enviar uma pergunta para ela, na verdade, responder, a gente poder ter aqui o nosso momento de troca também, fiquem à vontade para colocar no chat, tá bom? Então, vamos lá. So, fellas, could you please make some brief comments about your academic career as a researcher with research interests on medieval studies and especially the British Isles in the same period?
Okay. Before I go fully into that, I just want to say, as Isabel told you, that my training is in medieval studies and especially medieval history. But, since my PhD in 1988, through teaching, I have been learning and teaching about the places all over the world in many, many different time periods. And that informs the way I think about everything. Teaching in the United States and in Canada is very open and flexible, and we can teach about so many. In fact, we have to teach about so many different things. So there's my position as a researcher and then also my position as a teacher. So for my career as a researcher, I always say that the first big question that I had in life, and it goes even back to early childhood, is the question of why did Christianity appear to be the dominant majority religion in the places where I lived, and now we're talking about a childhood in New York City. And so the trying to answer that question, trying to understand how Christianity came to be the majority, and dominant religion in many parts of the world is what led me to study the post-Roman and early medieval period in Europe, because that was the period of the conversion of the first, time of the conversion of large stretches of territory to Christianity, right? So my interest was in this question of an international religious or cultural history, right? And especially the culture of Latin Europe. And so when I've paid attention as a researcher to the British Isles, it has never been because I'm interested in the British Isles per se, but because I'm aware of how people living in the British Isles are part of that international, increasingly Christianized culture. So any specific publications that I have done on the British Isles haven't also, been about, England or Britain per se. They have been about that bigger picture. So, for instance, one thing that I did that is English, is a translation of the Martyrology by the monk and scholar Bede, an 8th century, really, really important scholar and monk. I did a translation and a commentary on his Martyrology, but that was because I was at the time working through all of the oldest manuscripts that I could find at all, 6th and then especially 7th, 8th century manuscripts of martyrologies, right? Calendrical lists of Christian martyrs who were venerated as saints. And I was looking at those because my concern as a researcher was to try to understand the nature and function of the veneration of individuals who were thought of as martyrs for Christianity. I was trying to understand how that keeping alive the memory of those individuals and venerating those individuals was functioning politically, culturally, etc., in the places where they were being memorialized and venerated and commemorated. And Bede was one of the first people who put together, one of these calendars with, descriptions of the individuals and what they were venerated for. But the vast majority of the individuals, both historical and legendary, because many of them were legendary, were from the Mediterranean world, right? So that this source in and of itself of Bede's Martyrology was evidence of how people in the British Isles were part of a larger cultural zone, and even were trying to put themselves into that larger cultural zone and see themselves as connected to the Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. So all of my, and then in terms of, insulae, anything I've done as a researcher, as I said, that's connected to that has not really been primarily about the British Isles per se, right? My interest primarily is in those kinds of topics about the kind of dialogic interactions among people from different parts of the world, and intercultural connections and transformations and contacts. And so mission and conversion issues around Christianization, missionary activity, conversion of cultures is really a paradigmatic example of that kind of issue of cultural contexts, as missionaries come from, one place and they try to transform the traditional practices and beliefs in new areas. But frequently they do successfully transform the practices and beliefs of the people in the places where they have come to missionize. But what's really also fascinating is how those new converts always also transform the religion too, right? It's always a dialogic interaction. So, it's those kinds of issues that most interest me, and insofar as my research has been mostly in post-Roman and early medieval Europe, the British Isles are part of that world. So sometimes they come across my radar screen. That was it.
I see. I see. Well, thank you, Felice. And as a second question, could you please talk about considering the theoretical and methodological approach of both women and gender studies? Could you please elucidate the difference between these two fields?
Okay. So I'm going to speak especially from the perspective of historical disciplines, right? Not studies in general, although I do, read and use a lot of contemporary sociological work, for instance, as well. But I'm really going to talk from the perspective of historical disciplines. So I'll start by talking about the emergence of women's history as a professional field or subfield of history in the 1970s. And this is something I'm sure that everybody is already familiar with, but it's, maybe worth, saying anyway, right? As a fairly straightforward plan to stop erasing women from history, but instead to see them and, include what women did and said and wrote as an intrinsically valuable part of the picture of the past. And, this should have been 100% straightforward, but in fact, there was a lot of resistance to it at the time in the 1970s of older generations or even younger historians, like poo-pooing it and saying that there wouldn't be anything there or it wasn't, worth doing. I mean, that seems so absurd in retrospect, and it was demonstrated to be absurd almost immediately, right? The success of women's history as a field was more or less, inevitable as soon as people started paying attention to it, right? Because the whole picture that historians construct of the past really does completely transform as soon as you stop refusing to recognize the existence of women in it, right? It takes a lot of effort and distortion of the sources and the evidence to invisibilize women and to act as if they're not there. It's a lot easier to recognize reality and, to see them and to take them into account. Right. And so a lot of the first decades of work in women's history was pretty straightforward. And I'll even say, also speaking for myself, relatively easy and simple. My first major publication in 1988 was on the women missionaries, like contributions that women had made to the conversion of Western Europe and the British Isles, right, in the post-Roman period. And it was like incredibly easy because all I had to do was read the same sources that everybody had been reading and like point out all the women that were in them, right, and doing things. And it was like so simple, like just look, just stop refusing to see the evidence that is in front of your face. So, there were plenty of women who were, in all of the stories of conversion to Christianity. And, that's what I just wrote about, right, in the late 1980s. Another example, right, of really early work in women's history from the 1970s is a study called Many Tender Ties by Sylvia Van Kirk about the fur trade in Canada. And, this actually does relate to the British Isles insofar as Canada, especially Western Canada and the area of the fur trade is, an English colony, right? So we're talking about, a British colony, the lands run by the Hudson's Bay Company, the merchant company that basically, dominated the large stretches of what is now Canada, right? So this is her work in the 1970s is a great example of how for women's history, the trying to do any kind of history while invisibilizing the women and refusing to see them there actually, ends up with a completely distorted and useless picture that doesn't tell you anything and makes no sense, right? So before she wrote in the 1970s, historians of the fur trade in Western Canada and of British colonialism, British imperialism in Western Canada had been telling the story as if there were only men here, as if there were only, the European trappers and traders and, indigenous men who were also trappers, and as if there were literally no women at all, right? In the entire territory. And, she just looked through all of the records of the Hudson's Bay Company, right, of, the British government, of the imperial authorities. She saw that women were absolutely all over it. It was all indigenous women. She could absolutely demonstrate, with no difficulty from all of the sources, the absolute centrality of indigenous women to the fur trade, to most of the labor that was done in the fur trade, to the connections between the Europeans and the indigenous communities, et cetera, right? As soon as you see it, it is so obvious, right? And it is just astonishing that history could be and had been, written as if women, didn't even exist, right? So, and that has certainly continued, and there's a lot of just, women's history, medieval women's history, and from all places and times that has that same kind of straightforward nature, that it's just a question of actually being willing to remember and recognize that women exist and are like all over the sources. But of course, there's a lot more complicated women's history than that, that's much more sophisticated. And when historians and other kinds of historical scholars work in areas where it's less obvious and straightforward, and when they have to compensate for deficiencies in the archive or from limited amounts of evidence, but there's actually a surprising amount that still can be done that's pretty straightforward work with simple questions like, where were the women? What were the women doing? What was happening for women? Or what did this development mean for women, right? So for instance, historical developments such as the post-revolutionary establishment of democratic republics throughout the New World, right, in the wake of, and other places, right, in the wake of decolonization from Spanish and British empires and Portuguese empires, right, and all of that, right? So you get developments in the 19th century of giving voting rights to men or creating standing armies that draft and obligate men. And you can tell that common 19th century story as the story of freedom and democratization and the creation of the modern state. But if you ask, what does that mean for women, the creation of all of that, it means the creation of women as by definition not full citizens, right? And it's an exclusionary process, right? So something that from the perspective of some men is an inclusionary process of increasing political significance, right, through being part of the army, being part of the government, having rights, is from the perspective of women an exclusionary process that is trying to code them as not political and, domestic and private, et cetera, right? So that's, women's history, right, is just asking questions like, what does this mean if you pay attention to the existence of women, or see what something means for women, or from women's perspective. But it's histories of gender is so much more sophisticated and complex than that, especially by 2022, where we are now. When people who work in the field of gendered histories or the histories of gender really pretty much realize the necessity of being attuned to the plethora of different embodied experiences along so many different axes of, race, color, shade, gender identity, sexuality, age, religion, legal status, body size, ability, class, et cetera, right? So gendered histories, to just jump, to now, right, is really all of those things, right? And trying as much as possible to recognize all of those things. And the big things that contributed to that development, I would say, were in the 1990s, beginning to think more and more about masculinities, and then also the creation of queer theory. So masculinities meant and means looking at men as embodied full human beings, right? And also disaggregating the category men, right? To see that there are, in fact, many different ideals and scripts for masculinity and for how to be a man, and to see that they compete with one another, and some are dominant and others are subordinate. And just speaking for myself, I began to think about disaggregating the category of men before I really began to think through how important it was to disaggregate the category of women. That I actually first, understood that coming from masculinity studies, rather than from women's history. But that was, probably my personal failing. But from the 1990s, I think really increasingly historical scholars began to see the immense variety of experiences of people, and how sex or gender are only one factor, although, obviously a very important one. So, in the 1990s, I started to talk about, say, the ecclesiastical reform movement of the 11th century. So in Latin Europe, there is a movement in the 11th century that eventually leads, by the end of the century, to the legislation of clerical celibacy in the Roman Church, right? That Roman clerics are not supposed to be, married and have families, right? But if you think about that, thinking about the men as like embodied actual human people, I started to understand it differently as a men's virginity or a men's chastity movement, right? And so there has been, since the 1990s, so much absolutely fascinating work on clerical masculinities, right? And I'm not going to, talk more just about masculinities, just to move to, to queer theory. Queer theory from the 1990s absolutely exploded everything, right? And it was not in terms of historical scholarship, and not just in a way that was limited to the recognition of the historical recognition of sexualities beyond monogamous heterosexuality, although obviously that was part of it. But somehow scholars thinking through and with queer theory were able to see how so many things besides human sexuality were not straight, right? So just for instance, there are all sorts of nationalist historical narratives out there about the development of modern nation states. And those were over decades and sometimes centuries, or sometimes just years, right? Created by nationalist historians who would tend to ignore ethnic and religious and linguistic varieties inside the borders of the eventual nation state, right? But queering that narrative would help historians to reveal the complexities, right? The racial and ethnic and linguistic and religious complexities inside the boundaries, and change these easy nationalist histories and historical narratives from simple triumphant teleological developments to really contested, internally complex developments that involve the suppression of minorities and things like that, right? So queer theory helped historians, and it's central to gendered studies, right? Helped historians see the complexity of everything. And then the thing I want to say about many of these early theorists of masculinities and of queer theories, many of the early key theorists and researchers in those fields were trans people themselves, right? Which is interesting for helping us see how they were able to see so much more deeply and so many more complex ways than many people were at the time. And now, in the very last few years, in terms of gender histories, gendered studies, the recognition of the historical and contemporary existence of trans people is the thing that's really shaking everything up, and it's really transforming at least how I see the past, right? The recognition of how many people have transgender in so many different ways, right, throughout human history. So on some level, trans histories are now at the stage histories were at in the 1970s of just pure recognition, like, oh my God, look, that's right there in the sources. How did I miss that, right? But it's it's just transformative to think that way. So for instance, to use a medieval example, and an example also from the area where I have done most of my research and publication, that is veneration of Christian saints, right? There are so many individuals venerated as saints in the Christian tradition who, when they were alive, were living as not the gender that they were assigned at birth, right? There are so many so-called, transvestite saints in the Christian tradition, right? Especially in different monastic communities, right? And there was a recent article by Martha Newman called "Assigned Male at Death," right? Or "Assigned Female at Death." I forget what it was, but it was from a saint's biography of a venerated member of a monastic community, right? Who lived, and I can't remember which way it went, his or her whole lives, right? As a man or a woman, but then, in death was discovered to actually have the physical characteristics of the other sex. But the thing is, monastic communities and Christian history are just full of stories of people like this that for decades were understood as only as like transvestites, as people who were disguising themselves, right, for one reason or another, right? And all of a sudden, like with, you know, the recognition of trans identities, right? It's like, oh my God, these are maybe just trans people, right? It just changes everything. So I've just started to think about all of the different circumstances in which, you know, through military, through joining a religious community, through, you know, getting into different, you know, trades that were itinerant, that people could move away from an assigned sex at birth, right, and live in, you know, unfettered ways, right? So yeah, there's just, I mean, there's so much more obviously to say, but all of this together means that in 2022, and again, I'm really talking specifically from the question of historical disciplines, right? That I at least try to tell all of my historical stories, all of the things that I say about the past, in a way that attends to the varieties of gendered scripts and the embodied nature of human historical actors, right? Just in general. So, you know, if I'm telling the story of European conquests and colonizations in the so-called New World, and especially of Turtle Island, right, which is, you know, north, you know, what is now Canada and the United States in general. You know, it's, and you tell the story from the perspective of understanding embodied masculinities. There has been so much work done recently on European masculinities, demonstrating how incredibly violent European masculinity was, especially in the later Middle Ages and the early modern period. Like European invader colonial masculinity is thoroughly violent. I mean, a lot of the work that's demonstrated how violent European Christian, I should be saying Christian always, right? How violent European Christian masculinity was in the period leading up to the conquest of the New World has been done in the field, to circle back, of clerical masculinities. That some of the most interesting work has been to demonstrate how the middle and lower Christian clergy never accepted celibacy, never accepted these ideals that they should not have sex and they should not be violent, right? And that the lower Christian clergy in Europe were spectacularly violent, brawling people, like maybe the most violent people in their towns, right? That were just like, you know, bullying their parishioners because they actually had more power because of their like exemption from civil authority, right? All of these things. So European Christian masculinity is so violent, right, that even the clerics, even the male Christian clerics, or maybe especially the male Christian clerics, are, you know, are brawling, you know, violent bullies in their villages. So, you know, have this picture of, you know, European Christian masculinities, and then, you know, you study historically masculinities of indigenous communities on Turtle Island. I think this is very different in Latin America, right? But speaking of Turtle Island, right, the indigenous masculinities, even when they were caught up with hunting, were not warlike, right? Did not particularly value violence or militarism, right? So then the story of the conquest and colonization, the introduction of warrior invader masculinity into indigenous contexts on Turtle Island, and the effects that have on indigenous men on Turtle Island through colonial mimicry, right? And then the effects that all of that has on indigenous women. I mean, it's just transformational, right? So gendered histories tell stories like that, right? You don't just say, you know, and then came an army, you know, and they conquered this territory or something, and they brought in silver, you know, and they brought in furs or whatever. that's not the full story. The full story of what things mean for people are the stories of how, through colonial mimicry, indigenous masculinities adopted a kind of violence that was absolutely devastating for indigenous women. Like, that's gendered history, right? And that's an incredibly important story to tell. And you're not telling the full story at all if you're not telling all of those stories that attend to all of those dimensions. That was probably way more than you wanted and far too little medieval than what you wanted also, or insular, but.
No, that was wonderful. I think that if there is anyone who's interested on start studying at these fields, they should watch this video, watch this interview. It will be very enlightening and clarifying. Thank you very much. So now we're going for our next question. So Felice, please, could you tell us what do you think about the historical experience in the past, such as medieval period, from a contemporary perspective, which includes the gender studies? What do you think about it?
Well, maybe you could tell from, what I said before, that first of all, it's just important because it's incomplete, distorted, absurd, useless, and untrue to tell stories about the past that don't attend to all of those issues, right? So first of all, it's just like, if you actually want genuinely to understand anything about the past or present, then you must attend to all of those, axes of human existence that have been a part of the picture, right? So if you, but if you don't want to, if you just want to be some kind of a propagandist or something like that, of course you can just say, I'm going to refuse to recognize all of that. But, that seems to me to be, ridiculous, right? So most fundamentally, the thing is, we should be doing all of these things because we are not telling, ourselves or our audiences anything like a true picture of the past and human experience if we don't attend to everything that is now understood under, gendered experiences, with the proviso again that I do have to say that at least by 2022, at least in 2022, people who work in the field of gender studies or gender histories are not just talking about gender. They're per se, right? They understand that gender is classed and gender is raced, and gender, is different by religion and ability and all of these sorts of things, right? So again, just to be, kind of repetitive, the main thing is that the main reason we should do this is because that's what's true, and it's distorting and impartial if we don't do all of that. But even beyond that, it is important for people living today who have such an incredible range of embodied, gendered, raced, classed, etc. experiences, to learn something about their existence in the past, that does have a contemporary social and political relevance. Just the sheer recognition, for people to see how much variety has been out there. Particularly, in along the lines of varieties of sexualities and gendered scripts. But then there's something more specific about the way we talk about some examples of historical embodied human experience beyond just saying it existed. And as an example of that, I'll use how much recently scholars of enslaved people, let's take that example, how much recently scholars of enslaved people have been emphasizing the constant resistance of the enslaved to the conditions of their enslavement, right? That the kind of it is so important to recognize that no humans have ever accepted enslavement as a proper state for them, right? And historians have increasingly recognized all of the different modes of resistance that the enslaved, would use, right, as actual, resistance, and not just when you have like rebellions, right, but even just disobeying, right, even talking back, like, breaking a tool, or setting a little fire, all of the sorts of things, that people have done to resist exploitation, right, and subjugation and servitude are central in the present for not naturalizing subjugation and exploitation and class hierarchies, right? Stories in the past according to which supposedly there were happy slaves, or according to which enslaved people were content with their lot, can only be mobilized in order to argue that somehow now people today who are exploited or impoverished, or are subjugated, maybe perhaps that's their natural state, or maybe that's okay, or that's acceptable. No, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable now, and it has never been acceptable, right? It has. Perhaps you can find, and I know you can find sources produced by enslavers, by elites, by aristocrats, right, that will seek to claim that it is divinely authorized and perfectly just and correct that some people should be enslaved. Yes, you can find that, right? But you can't ever act as if that's the only voice that was out there, right? There were the oppressed were always somehow or other trying to fight back and resist, and that's been a real trend in economically labor-oriented, especially race-oriented, not race, but race-oriented scholarship about enslavement, that has a very important contemporary dimension. Similarly, about women's history, right? It's really important to demonstrate clearly and beyond a shadow of a doubt that, women, even if we don't disaggregate that, like, let's just, for the sake of argument for a moment, act as if all women are the same and have the same experience. It's really important, to demonstrate that women have always been central, active, doing things that, according to what, anthropologists now understand, women were the creators of the first tools. The very first tool ever was probably a baby carrier, right? To permit somebody to carry a baby and to have their hands free so that they could engage in, horticulture or gardening, right? Or, like, even if you accept in the gendered division of labor that, and of course there is definitely a gendered division of labor throughout human history and human society, right? So, if you start by saying, okay, it looks like those assigned female at birth tended on the whole to engage in things like foraging and, gathering berries, right? So, or cooking, right? All of these things, right? Like, then that's who made the tools for that. That's who made the baskets for, for gathering, the berries. I mean, that's who made, the first, ceramics for serving food. I mean, like, you have to centrally recognize the constant agency of those assigned female, right, and living as females in human society, because then you refuse to naturalize, again, any contemporary ideas about women as passive or domestic or unimportant or, you know, all of these sorts of anything that somebody tries to do in the present that would naturalize, you know, subjugation, right? So then like doing political history that shows, you know, how frequently, you know, women were in positions of, and elite women, of course, you know, were in positions of political authority and power, right, is really important for denaturalizing any claims, you know, that somehow women, you know, are not suited for political authority. So yeah, those are, yeah, that's the sort of thing, right? But it is imperative that historians truly aim for the real true picture, not just be propagandists and apologists for oppressive systems in place or cheerleaders for militarism. And, you know, I would actually also, though, say that it is an ethical obligation for everyone to work to dismantle systems of oppression and structures of privilege and exploitation and domination. And medievalists are no exception, right? And that's why we should do that, right? You know, we can do good in the world by refusing to invisibilize women, especially non-elite women and sexual and gendered minorities, right? And it's really important for every single person to know that their experience historically, you know, is a valuable, proper subject of historical research and scholarship, right? You know, there's not some people, you know, who are important and whose histories need to be told, and others who are not important, right? You know, that, and it's the obligation of all historians to be aware of that, ethically, morally.
Wow. Yes, a lot of things to process at the same time. For our fourth question, what are the projections today for the main streams of studies on women and gender, considering specific US and Canada, and broad from a more global perspective?
Oh, so that's the hardest question by far, because I'm a historian and I just get rolling and feel all sorts of confidence when I talk about what has already happened, but feel absolutely, you know, no competence to predict the future. Never. So with that proviso, I will say that just to talk about the situation at this moment, right, without predicting the future, that there are various places in the world, probably more than I'm aware of, where there are major reactions against the kind of gendered histories that I would, or analyses. Say there's major reactions against the kinds of gendered analyses that I've just been talking about. I think that gender studies has been outright outlawed in Poland and in Hungary, right? That they have, and there are, even in the United States, whatever, in the United States, there have been individual jurisdictions, states, universities, whatever, that have shut down, that closed women's and gender studies departments. There's, in the United States, all sorts of reactionary forces trying to get people to stop recognizing the reality, past and present, of gendered and sexual diversities, and of the realities of race and class and all of these sorts of things, right? There are bills, outlawing so-called critical race theory, or, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of reactionary political activism in the United States and in certain parts of Europe, which are the parts of the world that I know best, right now, to try to, as much as possible, put the brakes on and put a stop to the kinds of things that I was just talking about, right? Because clearly, it does clearly, the increased attention to the fullness of issues and experience around, race and class and gender and sexuality and ability and body size and religion and legal status, et cetera, right? The more those things are attended to as opposed to erased and ignored, the more problematic it is for entrenched elites and systemic structures of privilege and exploitation, right? So there's a reaction, and it's a problem, right? And all we can do is that reaction is not as pronounced in Canada right now as it is in certain places in the United States or in Eastern Europe. Places that have authoritarian regimes, Orban's regime in Hungary is an authoritarian regime. The Polish regime has been increasingly authoritarian. Since certainly before Trump, there have been really, really strong authoritarian, strands in American politics that, more and more average people have, for some reason, been deluded into thinking it's in their interests to get behind authoritarian ideas and ideologies. We don't have that, thankfully, so strongly in Canada right now. I could speak out of very, very impressionistic ideas about the global South or East Asia, where authoritarianism is either dominant or on the upswing, and where maybe it's not. But I know that it is, an issue all over the world, right? But there's a problem of rising authoritarianism and the attacks against women's and gender studies, especially the way they exist now, which is as something that really seeks to dismantle structures of privilege and exploitation, are part of that, right? People are, so we have to fight. But I don't know who's going to win, right? I don't know if the authoritarians are going to win, right? Because I can't predict the future at all, and if you had told me in the 1970s when I was a teenager in New York and thinking everything was on the right track and we're getting more and more liberal and more open and more progressive, if you had told me what, some of the things that were going to happen in the 21st century, I just would not have believed you, right? But now decades have gone by, and I very much see how the direction of history is not unidirectional and progressive, right? So,
yeah, I guess it's really a tendency some places, and unfortunately, Brazil is not different from there. Do we have time for a question at our chat, Felice?
Yeah. I mean, as I see, there's, it's 54 minutes, so we have 6 minutes. So
okay, so I'm just going to read it. It's a question from Pedro. This is just a random question, but I was wondering which topics would you like to see being further developed over the next years or decades in the fields of gender and medieval studies?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think right now there's two things that I would like to see. One is to really continue with these very recent insights of related to the existence of trans identities historically, right? I think that now that we're sensitive to that in the present, we can really go back and re-see or see differently a lot of sources, from the past. So that's something that is new and different and exciting. That I think would be great. But the other thing that I would like to see is nothing new or different. In fact, it's pretty old, and it's not what I do myself either. So, I shouldn't really talk, but I really would love to see more attention to labor, to work, to class, to economics, to those sorts of issues that were really big for a little while in the middle of the 20th century. Thinking about like the people who actually like do the work, of agriculture and whatever. I mean, I don't do that because I'm so much more interested in, intellectual culture and everything. But I do think that, medieval studies, maybe in particular, has and possibly history in general, with linguistic turns, discursive turns, all of these kinds of things, has maybe gotten too far away from looking at and speaking to the realities, the daily life realities of so many people. There was like a big series in the 1970s, that came out of, France, daily life in this, that, or the other place, right? So I do think that historians and medievalists, should speak more to the experiences of people who are, not necessarily the elites. And there is another thing that I will say, but I don't think, but not in the same way, because it's happening anyway. And that is like global medieval studies, right? To like really pay attention to the kind of global interconnections, or at least, widespread interconnections that any particular region, has with others, rather than looking in a very, pardon the expression, insular way at a particular place and time. It's something that has really mattered to me for a long time. Trying to develop comparative pre-modern studies, it's really so mythical that in the late 20th, 21st century is the first period of globalization and interaction. I mean, I'm certainly the pace and the modalities of global interactions have changed recently, but there's always been so much, interaction along things like the Silk Road, or, whatever. And that's something that I've really cared about and wanted to make medievalists in particular care about for a really long time, since like in the 1990s at Florida International University, when I taught in Miami. And by the way, like being in Miami had a big effect. Being in Miami for 23 years had a big effect in my like understanding globalization. I mean, I should have been able to get it from New York as well, but I didn't, in the same way, because everybody just came to New York and it felt like they were just collecting there. But in Miami, you see how you're at the nexus of things from all over, right? Or at least I saw it, more that way, right? So in the 90s, I founded this group, the Working Group for Pre-Modern Histories and Cultures at Florida International University. And, when I was, the kind of the main organizer of the Medieval Academy of America conference in Miami Beach in 2005, the theme was global medievalisms, and at the time it was really rare, and there was so much resistance, and, people like, it was really, really hard, and people weren't like seeing it that way. But now, like medieval studies in general, is really embracing medievalists. Many medievalists are embracing the idea of interconnections and interactions and global comparisons. That's really happening now. So I'll say I'd like to see that, but I don't feel about it the same way I do about recognition of trans identities and going back to some kind of sense of, labor, economic, foundation, the material base, because those are things that are not happening, whereas globalization of medieval studies for sure is happening, which makes me, really happy. So I want to give a shout out to, the people who are pushing that ball forward. And I do think it's great, but I don't think I need to call for it because it's happening.
Well, thank you very much, Felice, for this enlightening afternoon for us, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and for answering this final question. So we thank you very, very, very much. I could say for me and for Isabella and for Insula, we are very thankful for having you here in our Insula interview. So thank you again.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. And I hope that it was in fact somehow or other useful, and enlightening and not too different from what you wanted or expected, because as I said, I am a researcher in medieval studies, but most of my life is spent teaching very broadly. So
but that was nice, and
yeah.
we could hear from you, from someone who has like different experiences. That was really, really nice.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay. Great.
Bom, pessoal, a gente está encerrando a nossa entrevista, né? Hoje, celebrando o Dia Internacional das Mulheres. Então, espero que vocês tenham gostado, que tenha sido uma entrevista esclarecedora, principalmente abordando esse tópico sobre história das mulheres, estudos de gênero, que a gente sente às vezes tanta falta de ter material disponível, de ter conversas, né? Ainda bem que isso está mudando, está ficando uma conversa mais ampla, para que todos tenham acesso. A entrevista vai ficar gravada, quem não conseguiu assistir ela por completo, agora ao vivo, ela vai estar no nosso canal do YouTube. E lembrando que tem a lista de presença no chat do YouTube, que vocês podem assinar. E junto com as outras lives que a gente vai fazer nesse primeiro semestre, a certificação vai vir no final deste primeiro semestre, tá bem? Então não esqueçam de assinar. E junto com as outras lives que a gente vai fazer nesse primeiro semestre, a certificação vai vir no final deste primeiro semestre, tá bem? Então não esqueçam de assinar. E junto com as outras lives que a gente vai fazer nesse primeiro semestre, a certificação vai vir no final deste primeiro semestre, tá bem? Então, I think we had some mic problem, but okay. Então, pessoal, é isso. A lista de presença está disponível, assinem. Só podemos agradecer a presença de todos e todas aqui, mais uma vez conosco. E é isso, agradecer a Isabela pelo convite de estar mediando essa entrevista aqui no Insula hoje. E um feliz Dia das Mulheres para todas nós. Obrigada.